"It won't go away until I die." That statement was delivered by a 57-year-old man during a press conference in Mineola, New York, in March of 2026. He spoke with a flat, undramatic tone. It was the voice of someone who has long since abandoned the struggle against his own history. At 5 years old, that single image became his permanent reality. Follow him back, past the forensic laboratories and the 50 years of silence, to the morning of January 11th, 1974. Return to a suburban street called Sally Lane in Oceanside, Long Island, where the weather was freezing, gray, and wore a mask of total normalcy. 1974 Oceanside was a nearly perfect exhibit of American suburban life, appearing almost as if it were scripted for television. Colonial houses lined the roads, their driveways occupied by station wagons. It was a place where children attended the same schools their parents once had. These families were neighbors of such long standing that they had long ago stopped knocking before entering through a back door. In this environment, the word community represented something physical and certain, a collective vigilance, and a mutual care that required no discussion because it was a fundamental, unspoken law. The residence located on the 3900 block of Sally Lane was home to Jerry and Barbara Waldman. Jerry, a well-regarded local dentist, was the definition of stability. Barbara, however, operated on a different frequency. Barbara was 31, a graduate of New York University, a notable milestone for a woman of that era. She had long blonde hair and a laugh that invited everyone into the center of the joke. She existed in a state of constant melody and movement. She was the kind of mother who played on the floor with her children out of a genuine desire for their company rather than a sense of duty. Her household included 3 children: Mara, 7, Larry, 6, and Eric, who had just turned 5. She was a dedicated volunteer for the Oceanside Cancer Society. She was sincerely present for her neighbors, engaging with her community in a way that was entirely devoid of performance. She held a deep conviction that contributing to something beyond one's own front door was essential. The residents of Sally Lane knew her intimately, often hearing the echoes of her laughter drifting through open windows on summer afternoons. They recognized that her home held a warmth that went far beyond the heating system. On the morning of January 11th, the standard school routine commenced. A blur of backpacks and breakfast, the minor friction of moving 3 young children out the door when no one wanted to wear a coat. Mara and Larry departed for their school day. Eric boarded the bus for his half-day kindergarten session, meaning he would return first. Jerry drove away to open his dental clinic, and then Barbara Waldman was left alone in the stillness of the Sally Lane house. Dressed in a nightgown and a blue bathrobe, she settled into a slow morning, the rare luxury of peace that follows the departure of 3 children. She had no reason to fear, yet fewer than 4 miles away, a 26-year-old man was already navigating the early hours of that same day. He was a sanitation worker in Oceanside. He was intimately familiar with these specific blocks. He may have stood at the curb of that very driveway, performing the most mundane task imaginable while watching the family's morning departure. No one noticed him. There was no logical reason for anyone to pay him any mind. That is the central horror. There are sights a 5-year-old's neurology is simply not equipped to process. It is not a matter of intelligence. The human psyche, at any age, lacks the inherent architecture to absorb extreme trauma without warning. The mind slows down when confronted with information that has no category, no context, and nowhere to be stored. Around midday, Eric Waldman stepped off his bus and walked toward his front door, following the same path he had taken every day of his young life. The entrance, the steps, the familiar scent of home, everything appeared exactly as it should have been, yet everything was wrong. Inside, the atmosphere felt alien in a way Eric could not articulate. The television was dark when it should have been active. The kitchen sat empty. The psychic hum of a lived-in home, that low, constant vibration children sense, without realizing it had completely vanished. He searched the ground floor before moving toward the staircase and the second-floor hallway, reaching the door to his parents' bedroom. There, amidst a sudden shock of blue from his mother's robe, his childhood came to a violent end. Barbara Waldman was lying prone on the floorboards beside her bed. She had been bound, the assailant, ensuring she could not flee the room or the situation. The scene suggested a calculated, forced isolation. She had died from a single, lethal injury, a finality that precluded any hope. She was 31. The home had not been searched or ransacked. No glass was broken, no furniture was overturned, and there was no evidence of a struggle that extended beyond that one room. The violence was contained and purposeful. From the outside, from the perspective of any neighbor or passerby on the street, the house on Sally Lane betrayed no sign that an atrocity had occurred. That lack of external disturbance would eventually become a detail of immense significance. Law enforcement arrived and instantly understood the truth. This was no accident. It was a deliberate, lethal act. The quiet street was soon overtaken by patrol cars and that heavy, suffocating silence that follows an unspeakable crime. Forensic teams documented the scene. They secured a biological trace from Barbara's blue robe and lifted a single fingerprint from the house. Neighbors provided the first leads. They described a man moving with hurried purpose away from the residence. He was noticeable enough to be remembered, but not strange enough to be stopped. From these memories, a composite sketch took shape. A face, a build. But it was 1974. The technology was not yet there. The sample could not be analyzed. The print found no match. The sketch remained just ink on a page. Jerry Waldman was summoned from his dental clinic. He returned to a home teeming with investigators and the sudden, hollow void of his wife's absence. Amidst the forensic chaos of that afternoon, he had to find the strength to speak. He brought his 3 children together, Mara, Larry, and Eric. At only 5 years old, they had already witnessed a horror no child should ever see. They were already carrying a burden far beyond their years. He told them an intruder had entered the home. He said their mother was in heaven. He told them she was never coming back. Mara would recount those specific words 5 decades later with haunting precision. Not for their eloquence, but because they marked the end of the life they knew and the beginning of a long, difficult journey without her. Investigators examined the perimeter. There were no signs of forced entry. The house had not been tossed. Nothing was stolen. They looked at the husband, the dentist. He was steady. He had been at work. His alibi was clean. For some, it was perhaps too clean. In the absence of a suspect or a name, a frightened community often looks for a villain closer to home. People crave a narrative that fits their worldview. They want to believe that such violence must have a logical origin. They need to feel that evil doesn't just walk in off the street without a reason. And so, the murmurs started. Quietly at first. The rumors traveled through the neighborhood like a slow-moving shadow, filling the gaps between polite conversations. It lived in the sudden silences and the heavy looks exchanged across rooms that communicated everything without a word. The husband survived, and the wife was dead. To many, that was proof enough. Yet Jerry Waldman did not flee. He stayed in Oceanside. He never retreated from the eyes of the public. He continued his practice and raised his 3 children, eventually becoming a respected figure in the Oceanside community. He endured the weight of his situation with a quiet dignity that was rarely acknowledged by those who whispered. But dignity is not a shield against gossip, and the children heard the talk. Mara, Larry, and Eric grew up under that heavy cloud. Their mother's photographs were put away, kept out of sight. The family lived in silence because there were no words for what had happened and no closure to settle the grief. They grew up knowing that some suspected their father. That particular cruelty, the suggestion that their only remaining parent was the source of their pain, became a permanent scar. It was one of the deepest wounds the case left behind. Meanwhile, the law used what tools it had. The sketch was circulated. Every lead was chased. The homicide unit worked with initial urgency. but months eventually stretched into years. No one was ever charged. The evidence was boxed and moved to storage. The robe, the print, and the biological sample sat in the dark, waiting for a science yet to be born. The case went cold. Then came the period of false leads. Documenting these events requires weeks of archival research and the careful vetting of facts. There are no shortcuts in these investigations. Roughly 15 days of reconstruction go into every case because accuracy is essential when dealing with real lives. If these stories are worth remembering, consider the evidence presented. Think on which detail of this tragedy is the most difficult to accept. Your attention to these facts is what allows the record to remain open. Further documentation on unsolved cases is maintained in the records. Now, returning to the evidence. Years later, a man in prison came forward with a detailed confession. He claimed he was responsible for the death of Barbara Waldman. For a family that had waited decades for a breakthrough, that admission must have felt like the end of the nightmare. But genetic testing proved it was a lie. He had never been on Sally Lane. Investigators then shifted their focus back to 1968 and a homicide in Valley Stream, a neighborhood near Oceanside. The parallels to the Waldman tragedy were striking enough to warrant a formal inquiry, a recurring predator, or perhaps a dark pattern. Genetic analysis eventually silenced that theory as well. Every violent offender with ties to Long Island underwent a systematic review. Each lead was methodically severed. Doors closed. Each time the family prepared for a resolution, they were met only with the cold endurance of silence. In 2004, Nassau County detectives submitted a biological sample from Jerry Waldman for formal analysis. He was cleared. The exclusion was absolute and final. Crime scene evidence bore no relation to Jerry Waldman. The evidence was never his. Science confirmed that the man under a shadow for 30 years was not his wife's killer. A different contributor existed. An unidentified male had left his signature on that bathrobe, and he remained unknown. With no remaining paths to follow, the investigation was quietly archived. Jerry Waldman passed away in 2007, never knowing the truth. Less than 4 miles from Sally Lane, Thomas Generazzio remained alive. He had been there the entire time, continuing his daily labor. He moved through the streets, reaping the benefit of years without accountability, while Barbara's children lived within the wreckage of his actions. He succumbed to cancer in 2004. It was the same year Jerry Waldman was officially cleared of suspicion. As the investigation stalled, he believed his secrets died with him, yet some truths do not fade. In a county storage facility, through decades of changing administrations and the retirement of entire generations of detectives, a sealed cardboard box sat in the dark. Inside, filed among evidence from January 11th, 1974, lay a single blue bathrobe, a piece of clothing that had been held in preservation for 50 years. Beyond that box, the world had fundamentally changed. Men reached the moon. The Cold War reached its conclusion. The internet was constructed and then placed into every pocket. Entire scientific disciplines were born, matured, and revolutionized. The code of the human genome had been fully sequenced. Massive ancestry databases were established by corporations whose founders were not yet alive on January 11th, 1974. The bathrobe remained in waiting. In 2022, Marlo Waldman viewed a televised documentary. An investigative journalist had spent years analyzing over 100 unsolved murders involving women on Long Island. Her work culminated in a production titled The Forgotten, which was eventually broadcast to the public. Mara watched the broadcast and initiated contact. The intersection of media scrutiny and a family's relentless pursuit of the truth forced authorities to reopen the file. Re-examining the evidence in 2023 with modern technology proved that the scientific landscape had shifted entirely. Working with the FBI, local investigators achieved what had once been considered an impossibility: an exhaustive genetic profile from the sample on the bathrobe. It was neither partial nor fragmented. A definitive genetic map of the unknown individual. A biological signature, cold and precise. The signature of the man who stood in that bedroom 40 years ago. They held his essence, but lacked his name. In 2024, Nassau County officials formed a partnership with a private forensic laboratory, a Texas-based facility engineered specifically to recover genetic data from evidence that had defeated standard forensic methods. Technicians utilized forensic-grade genome sequencing. This process far exceeds a simple database inquiry. The method does not depend on the suspect being previously enrolled in a government criminal database. It decodes the entire genome of the contributor, creating a profile compatible with massive genealogical repositories. These are the same archives where millions of citizens have shared their data to trace their own lineages. The logic is chillingly efficient. You are not searching for the man himself, but for his kin, a relative who shares sufficient biological traits to allow for the reconstruction of a family tree. By navigating decades of public records, investigators narrow the search until only one individual remains as a viable source. In August of 2024, a faint genetic signal emerged. Not a direct identification, but a flicker in the data. A distant alignment between the robe's evidence and a user within a genealogical archive. A single thread, a starting point. Federal forensic experts began the arduous task of mapping out the suspect's lineage, speaking with distant relatives and cross-referencing names against property deeds and legal filings. Sifting through employment histories and death certificates, they methodically pruned the branches of a forgotten family tree. The focus narrowed toward a solitary point of origin. That origin had a name, Thomas Generazzio, born February 1st, 1947, Oceanside, New York. He was not from a neighboring town or a distant county. He belonged to Oceanside, the same soil where Barbara Waldman lived and died. His home sat a few streets away from Sally Lane. He was a local employee, a worker for the Oceanside Sanitation Department. This meant he navigated those specific grids as a profession. He knew the geography. He was a fixture of the mundane, an invisible man in a public role. He moved through the community with such ordinariness that his presence invited no second glance. Investigators considered a chilling possibility they could not formally confirm. Generazzio may have been the Waldmans' own waste collector. He might have stood at the edge of their property, performing the most unremarkable labor. He could have observed the private rhythms of that home. He watched from the most transparent vantage point imaginable. His criminal record contained 2 entries. One, arrest for assault, another for possession of stolen goods. In a modern era, these police encounters would have logged his DNA. The bathrobe would have spoken 50 years sooner. But during those arrests, genetic collection was not yet a standard protocol. He remained a ghost in the system. No profile, no suspicion, no interrogation rooms. Public records suggest he never even grazed the perimeter of the original manhunt. In 1974, neighbors described a man near the scene. A sketch was drawn. 50 years later, police compared that drawing to his photograph. It was an eerie, near-perfect resemblance. He was present. He was hidden in the files, in the drawings, in the very fabric of a bathrobe kept in a cold storage box. The evidence waited with a silent, mechanical patience that only objects possess. Cancer took Thomas Generazzio in 2004. He was 57. He spent his final decades in the same neighborhood where he committed the atrocity. No handcuffs, no questions. He never answered for the life he stole from Barbara Waldman. He never faced the 3 children left to navigate the wreckage of that January dawn. Yet, the evidence remained. It waited for Othram and the FBI genealogy unit. It waited for 2024. A single genetic thread finally allowed detectives to reach back to 1974. The void finally had a name. The news arrived in 2024. There were no cameras or podiums, just a ringing phone. A simple call, For 50 years, Barbara Waldman had balanced the hope of this moment against the certainty of its impossibility. Detective Sino spoke from the other side. Silence followed. Then, 4 words erased 50 years of ambiguity. "We have a match." Mara collapsed. This was not a metaphor. Her physical form simply failed. When the mind finally drops a weight it has carried for decades, the body has no choice but to follow it to the ground. She traveled to New York. She sat in a room with the authorities. For the first time, she heard the biography of the Shadow, Thomas Generazzio, a local worker, born in 1947, a neighbor. The name meant nothing to her. No hidden memory surfaced. No face from the past clicked into place. He was an absolute stranger, a man who walked into their home, shattered their reality, and then simply resumed his mundane existence until the end. He lived in peace while the Waldman children grew up in a house built of grief. March 11th, 2026, in Mineola, Commissioner Patrick Ryder took the lectern. He spoke the words the Waldmans had needed for 52 years. Federal agents flanked him. Beside them stood the 3 Waldman siblings. They were adults in their late 50s now. They had been 5, 6, and 7 when the lights went out. Mara stepped forward. Her tone was flat and controlled. It was the sound of a person who has spent a lifetime mastering their own sorrow. 52 years of practice. Fitting an ocean of trauma into a vessel small enough to carry through a normal day. She described a childhood defined by absence. She spoke of the whispers that haunted their father, the specific, lingering malice of a community suspecting an innocent man. Then came the sentence she had rehearsed in her soul for decades. Happily today, 52 years later, I get to say to the world that our father, Jerry Waldman, is exonerated. He was a casualty, never a culprit. Jerry Waldman passed away in 2007. The public clearing of his name came too late for him to hear it. He never saw the official documents. He never knew that technology would eventually solve the puzzle that defeated the detectives of his time. He died under a shroud of suspicion and mourning. 30 years of doubt paired with a broken heart. Neither burden belonged to him. For those who harbored doubts, Mara entered the testimony into the official record under the unblinking gaze of the cameras. Larry reflected on the man he had become in the wake of tragedy, displaying a striking lack of resentment that defied expectation. He believed that the sudden, unexplained theft of his mother when he was merely 6 years old had forged him into a more present father. He became a more attentive partner, carrying the visceral understanding that those we love are never a certainty for tomorrow. This moment serves as a final clearing of the name for Jerry Waldman, a father who passed away haunted by the absence of motive or identity. Eric remained largely silent. His presence alone communicated enough. He had previously uttered a truth so absolute it required no further explanation or palliative phrasing. Transitioning to his words, "I've had the image of my mom in my head since I'm 5, and it won't go away until I die." This was the ultimate toll of January 11th, 1974. Beyond the murder, a trauma was inflicted upon a 5-year-old child that no forensic breakthrough could ever truly heal. Naming Thomas Generazzio provided Eric Waldman with the answers he sought. It offered the facts. It could not, however, replace the mental image of the woman he lost. Nothing possesses that power. Commissioner Ryder abandoned diplomatic phrasing, stating clearly that the ideal outcome would have been Generazzio's lifelong imprisonment. He should have been behind bars for every single year the Waldman children spent navigating life without their mother's guidance. Ryder characterized the killer as a predator for his actions that morning, labeling the crime utterly beyond defense. He spoke with the heavy weariness of a veteran officer who remains unsettled by the reality that some monsters evade earthly justice. Generazzio never experienced the inside of a prison cell for even one day. He was never interrogated, never indicted, and never compelled to face the family whose lives he destroyed to answer for his depravity. Cancer took his life at 57, occurring in the very same neighborhood where he had committed the murder. His name remained unknown to the public until 22 years after his death. By any legal standard, this is not justice. It lacks the resolution of a trial or a definitive sentence. Yet, Mara had already confronted this reality with the deliberate composure of a daughter. She spoke as someone who had spent decades contemplating what true resolution would actually look like for her. In her own words, "The innate desire and goal of solving my mother's murder case was not about seeking legal punishment." She continued, "It is an emotional and psychological resolution, a closure that allows us as a family to acknowledge that her death was a serious crime, put unresolved trauma behind us, and honor our mother's memory with a full understanding of the facts, the truth." Following the briefing, the Waldman children visited their mother's final resting place. They carried a small card, left as a tribute by the investigator who finally solved the mystery. After 52 years of silence, the inscription on the card felt less like a greeting and more like a definitive mission statement. The card read, "To the living we owe respect, but to the dead we owe only the truth." They set it upon the headstone and told her the work was finished. Barbara Waldman was 31 years of age. She was a university graduate and a tireless mother who possessed a vibrant, full-bodied laugh that brought warmth to any space she occupied. She was never merely a cold case file or a forensic specimen in a plastic bag. She was a human being. Over 5 decades after the morning she was stolen from those who cherished her, the absolute truth of her fate has finally been established. It was delayed by decades, but it has finally come to light. For the 3 children who spent a lifetime waiting, these facts were everything. It won't go away until I die. On the 11th of January, 1974, 5-year-old Eric Waldman stepped off his school bus, walked into his home, and his childhood ended forever. He has carried that image every single day since, for 52 years. "I've had the image of my mom in my head since I'm 5, he said quietly at a press conference in 2026, "and it won't go away until I die." There is no sentence in the English language more heartbreaking than that one. Barbara Waldman was 31 years old, a mother who laughed loudly, played on the floor with her children, and volunteered for her community. She was murdered by a man nobody noticed, a sanitation worker who walked the same streets, collected the same garbage, and disappeared back into ordinary life. For 52 years, her husband Jerry was shadowed by suspicion. He died in 2007, never officially cleared, never at peace. The truth came too late for him. But in 2026, DNA technology finally named the killer. And Mara Waldman stood before the cameras and said the words she had been waiting her entire life to say. "Our father, Jerry Waldman, is exonerated. Justice without a trial. Truth without a courtroom. Closure without a living perpetrator." Is it enough? The Waldman children say yes, because the truth itself is the point. To the living we owe respect. To the dead we owe only the truth. They placed that card on their mother's grave and told her, "The work is finished." Some cases take 52 years, but truth, when it finally arrives, is still truth.